If your child was born today, so 18 years from now, and their first go to their first year of college, having 4 years of tuition and fees, including room and board, would probably be about $242,000. That may actually not be in today's dollars. That may be a growth in that over time. I don't know what the growth rate is, which is interesting. The other one too is just saving in general. Gives a good idea of compounded growth. So if you were to begin contributing $500 per month for college savings at birth, assuming a 5.8% rate of return, which I'd say is conservative, I like that rate, your savings sum would total about $213,600 by the time they reach 17. If you postpone saving until your child is 10, then your savings would roughly be about $78,400.
Welcome to Critical Thinking Required, hosted by LBW. This podcast is intended for free thinkers, entrepreneurs, and knowledge seekers. Join us as we discuss relevant financial topics, explore with guests their financial journeys, and engage with experts in industries such as space, media and entertainment, real estate, and many more. Buckle up and enjoy the ride.
Welcome to Critical Thinking Required. You're with your host, myself, Tim Bickmore, and my colleague, Dan Weiss. And today we are going to talk about something that Dan experienced approximately almost 7 years ago. Going to be 7 years?
In a week.
Happy birthday, Leora. Becoming a new parent. It's a very big deal. It's a big change when it comes to your life, when it comes to your finances. And we want to talk a little bit about, things to think about when you become a new parent. More from the financial perspective. We're probably not going to get into all the other stuff, but we want to talk about the finance side of becoming a new parent. A lot of our clients go through this, and it's a big topic, and there's a lot of different topics to hit. We probably won't hit everything today. We really want our audience to start to think a little differently about, if I am looking to have a child, or I just had a child, did I miss anything? Do I need to plan for anything? What are things I need to think about? So first and foremost, the first thing that we are going to hit, because as I say quite a bit on this podcast, we are broken records, is cash flow. It is an immediate change to cash flow, and that's what we want to talk about. So a new budget, new expenses are coming up. Let's say that right now you have been pregnant, you and your spouse, and you probably already starting to get the new nursery together, plan on new things, right? Increasing costs. Typically speaking, those costs start a little slow, but they accelerate pretty quickly once they get older. So Dan, you want to hit on a little bit from the standpoint of what should we do from a cash flow perspective for like cash on hand? What are we thinking about being new parents?
Well, your life is never the same again. And so your budget changes too. When we calculate cash flow for people, we always think about a rule of thumb from a starting standpoint, and then we recognize that rule of thumbs are terrible, and then we move off that, we pivot off that to make it specific. Rule of thumb standpoint, what Tim and I like to see people going in general, just having from emergency fund standpoint, is 3 to 6 months worth of all expenses that we would consider, period. Sometimes people will suggest having 6 months or 3 months of what would be referred to as non-discretionary expenses, things you have to pay, like your rent, your car payment to keep your car. Tim and I have always been supporters of all expenses because we don't want someone's mindset to change during life changes that is going to affect how they operate and mess everything else up. Plus, it's also easier to figure out, and this is not as easy as it sounds to figure out, and therefore when people get stressed about it, they just simply don't do it. So 3 to 6 months of all expenses is our rule of thumb. Mm-hmm. And then from there, it depends, right? What kind of work you do. It depends what other assistance you have, whatever be the case. Well, guess what? We're going to redo all of this right now when it comes to having a child, because your expenses, they are going to go up for sure, whether it's formula, diapers, childcare, usually the largest one. I mean, just to give an idea, if you are out here in Madison, on average, you are looking typically about $1,000 on average from a lot of sources we see a month for daycare expenses. A lot of our clientele coming out of Los Angeles, the average in LA is about $1,500 a month for childcare. And these are facilities. If we're looking at hiring in a nanny, The going rate in Los Angeles is usually about $30 to $40 an hour, and it's very difficult to find a nanny to begin with. Here, just like most other cost of life adjustments, you're looking about half the cost. I think on average, a nanny is about $16 to $17 an hour here.
Yeah,
But,
around 20, actually, probably closer to 20
now?
Madison, Wisconsin. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think my dad is Wisconsin in general is about 1606, I think, on average. But yeah, Madison's probably a little higher.
Yeah.
It's not inexpensive. So you've got to plan on probably a good $10,000 to $20,000 a year on average, just in daycare alone. And then of course there's other things that will come up, from medical bills to toys. And another thing I think a lot of parents don't realize is health insurance is not standardized. To some people have very different costs when it comes to the birthing process to begin with. I think I remembered when Leora joined all of us as our mascot 7 years ago almost. I think out of pocket I paid roughly about $9,500 or so for the birth itself. So you probably need to have some savings based on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's good to probably review your insurance plan prior to going in and understanding exactly what those costs may look like. Understand, and then there's sometimes there's complications during pregnancy that you're just not expecting. So it's always good to build in a margin of safety, knowing that, hey, you just don't know what's going to happen if you had to have an emergency C-section or some complication where you have to stay in the hospital longer, or if the child has to stay in the hospital longer. There is a lot of things that happens. It's not almost, it's common. So, it's just part of the process. Hopefully that does not happen, but you always want to make sure you plan for the worst, to make sure going into it.
Because Tim brought this up so astutely, take a look as to what your company does for a parental or for maternal leave. The changes from time to time, because what's going to also affect your budget is income. Is someone going to stay home, or are they not, and to what degree? And also health plans in general. We do a lot of counseling when it comes to fitting the right health plan for somebody. If you have not had kids and you've been healthy and so on, you maybe have been participating in a HSA, a health savings account. That may not make sense going forward now that you have a child in the picture. Or to mention too, like, things can change when it comes to childbirth. If health costs in general are going to be more costly, an HSA may not make sense anymore. And I'll tell you this from firsthand experience, where I may not go to the doctor at times for things. If Leora is not feeling good, I go to the doctor. So there's also this added responsibility, pressure, whatever the case, to go to the doctor when need be. Okay, estate planning.
Yep.
Yeah. Most Americans, about half Americans, I think a little more than that, have done zero for estate planning. We've done a lot of these podcasts just in estate planning alone. If you haven't done it by now, hopefully this is the trigger to do some of this. In a lot of states, Wisconsin being one of them, the place where you list a guardian for your child is in your will. And you may have had conversations or so with people in the past or wrote it down somewhere, but if you want that to hold water, according to many attorneys that we've spoken with, if nothing else, it's time to do a will so you can list a guardian. And there's a number of things to think about when it comes to something like that.
I think in addition to, if you haven't done any type of an estate plan, getting some of the free documents that your state offers is a big deal prior to going and delivering a child. Obviously that can become, again, depending on the circumstance, can get a little bit more risky. You want to make sure that you have a power of an attorney signed for both your health and finances. Just because you are married does not necessarily mean that your spouse can go ahead and access your accounts or act on your behalf. You need to make sure that that's in writing and it is signed and most likely notarized, to make sure that you can have your wishes be taken care of in the event that something does happen. We typically suggest that with any big surgeries that are going on, and typically doctors will actually push it to be done depending on what surgery you're going into. But if you have done nothing at all, at least doing that prior to giving birth is a good idea. You should do it anyways, but again, in general, it's a very good idea to do it. And then once this child is here, depending on assets and size, that's when maybe having a more in-depth conversation about what does a trust look like? Well, why would you want to have a trust? Why would you want to have a will, right? And having some of those conversations around that. But again, that is very just dependent on your life at the moment, asset size, and different things. So talking to professionals is always a good idea, but should be on your checklist to review.
Glad you brought up trusts. If we do see estate planning, a lot of times it doesn't include that. Trusts are not just about, as we've spoken in other podcasts, about having a lot of money. They are also about providing some instruction and direction if something prematurely happens to you. So trust and guardian in general tend to be the two largest responsibilities from a difficulty standpoint and people making that decision that we find when it comes to estate planning. The trustee has a lot of power. So how are they going to distribute money to their children? Sometimes people make the children trustees. Does that make sense? Does that not? People change, they develop. How much control do you actually give them? These are really important issues to have so that your hard work plays out the way you want to, and so that we don't create stumbling blocks for these kids that are just unseen.
Yeah.
And guardian is tough too. No one's going to raise this child like you would. So there's a lot of factors that go into that besides even just the personality and where would the child live? What would the belief system be in place? What would the hobbies that they would be? And there's so much stuff to really consider that factors in. It's never going to be perfect, but these are not usually easy discussions to have, things to think about.
But discussions should be had, which is great.
Absolutely.
I think for like the next topic, going off estate planning, which is a little bit close tied, is life insurance, right? That should probably be also on our checklist, is checking out, do we have life insurance? Where is life insurance located? Do we have it through our work? Do we have a supplemental policy outside of our work? What does that all look like? Now, typically speaking, for Dan and I, when we see a lot of our clients in the younger generations, is they'll have sometimes whole life policies that they've been sold, or universal life policies, or they don't have anything, or they just have work. Dan and the firm and I are very big believers of making sure that their insurance is for risk mitigation. It is not for investments. They should be separate ideas and they should not be turned in together. So we're very big proponents of term life insurance. And so typically speaking, if we have, let's say, a couple and they come to us and they don't have any children, and let's say they're renting and they don't have a lot going on, both very successful within their careers, we'll say, yeah, you probably don't need additional life insurance at the moment. The moment they do start saying, hey, we're kind of thinking about having kids, Dan and I will start pushing on that button saying, hey, we should really review our life insurance and seeing if we need supplemental policies, because that's going to be important. Because just because you're at work, taking on the group policy after you're to leave is probably going to be more expensive than just having your own supplemental outside of being tied to your work policy, which is really important. Now, the reason why all of a sudden Dan and I changed our tone on that is because now you have a dependent. That dependent is dependent on your income of both your spouse and yourself. And that means you are at a higher risk, and you want to make sure you're protecting yourself through that higher risk moments of your life. And so that's when all of a sudden that conversation comes up, it changes, and you want to look at it. As Dan says very well, from the life insurance perspective, making sure we do it before we get pregnant and other things is probably a good idea to do. It's easier to do. And as the younger you do it, the better the premiums can be for you and your spouse. So it just starts to make sense to maybe get that done, or really take a look at it at least and review where you're at from a life insurance standpoint, because you're about to get real risky real fast.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Tim. We have seen before where health changes during pregnancy, and sometimes, whether it's a temporary situation or not, your insurability can also change. So we definitely want to, in an ideal world, get this in place before somebody becomes pregnant, just to not have to worry about those components at play. And a lot of times the miss that we find is if a spouse stays home, then they don't have insurance. And because they're not contributing monetarily to the household, it often gets missed that there's still a major cost in childcare, if nothing else. And there usually is quite a bit more on top of that is being really shifted to this person that is not shifted if they're gone. Or we have a lot of clients that are entrepreneurs that don't think about this component because it's not, they are the ones that provide it. And a lot of times that's a huge risk, because that income changes significantly if you're gone and you can't operate the business. Who operates that? What does that trickle down to the family members left over? How do you do that? And there's a number of arrangements to do that.
Yep. And I would say too that the conversation of a stay-at-home spouse comes up quite a bit. And Dan is correct. They may not be bringing monetarily, like working and getting a paycheck, but again, as Dan mentioned about childcare costs, they are saving you anywhere from 30 to 60 grand per year. So they are contributing in a very real way, and that is a very big hole if that person were to be gone. And it needs to make sure that hole is covered up, because what would happen is if that spouse was no longer there, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden the spouse that was working can become the stay-at-home parent, right? They have to continue to work and most likely get childcare in order to sustain the current situation. The other thing that I don't always love that gets brought up is people say, oh, don't worry, they'll just get remarried. I don't really think you should plan on that either. I think that you should be sufficiently set up to make sure that no matter what, that spouse is being able to be taken care of either way. That conversation also happens, again, to be to each their own. We would just push back on that a little bit and say, hey, maybe you should start thinking about that a little bit differently.
And a lot of these kind of policies can be terminated or replaced if situations change, but if they change beforehand, it may not be in your control anymore. How about educational planning, Ben?
Oh, educational planning is a good one. I think that educational planning should also be starting to talk of. I think this actually leads into even a broader conversation. When Dan and I were looking at this, our outline, we were talking about other big costs, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs. You're looking at, down payments on homes when they're older, or
First car.
Let's say you really want them to be a hockey player, and the cost of hockey, right? Like there's a lot of other extracurricular activities or things that you may want to help children with. Education just happens to be a front and forward topic because everyone wants their child to be educated, to be successful in the world. Starting early always makes sense, right? Starting savings at any age, compounded growth helps. It really, truly does. Now, the question, though, goes back to our first point of cash flow. What can you do? What can't you do? Even before that, we have a lot of conversations about this, and spouses typically don't agree on what they should or shouldn't fund. The question is, well, why? Because people have different experiences. We have some people, they'll say, my parents paid for all my college, I want to do the same thing. The spouse will say, over my dead body, I paid for all my college and worked all my way through, and my kids will do the same thing, right? There's a very big difference in that potential funding, which also makes a big difference on how much you should or should not be contributing. So having those conversations with your spouse and coming with a compromise and an understanding is very helpful in order to achieve that common goal. Now, the other thing about education planning is how you set that education planning up. Do you do a 529 plan? Do you do a non-qualified plan? Do you mix the non-qualified account? Do you mix those strategies? Why would you mix them? Why shouldn't you mix them? What would that really look like? Where do you think the education system will be in 18 years? I don't know. Maybe it's all paid for. Who knows? There's a lot of issues in the education system that are being fought out within the political system. So there's a lot going on specifically for educational planning. But the first and foremost step is to sit down with your spouse and say, hey, how much would you want to fund? And it's not just undergraduate school. We have a lot of conversations with graduate school, because we have some clients that have MDs, JDs, right? Different graduate level education. We're like, hey, I want to help pay for that. I want to see them go towards that goal. So having that understanding is very important. I can say, though, with a lot of confidence, it's not cheap. It's not the cheapest thing in the world. And you definitely have to save a lot. And then does it make sense then for your overall budget? And what is that opportunity cost, and how do you really want to look at it? So it's a big conversation. But it's just definitely something to first talk about and then start to look at your options.
It's dynamic. Money is fungible. Opportunity costs are real.
Yep.
Things you may not think about. For example, you have to balance your own goals, retirement and pre-retirement, with these kind of concepts as well. We get a lot of young parents that have not bought homes, or they've bought a starter home and they know they now have to create more room. And so things that get factored in are like schooling. So if we're talking to some of our LA clients, it may make sense to pay up for a house because that house is in a school district that sits outside of LA County schools if that's what you're trying to avoid. And so maybe you're buying in Culver City or Burbank or Brentwood, or Beverly Hills. And in those situations, you're going to pay up for the house partly because you're buying into the school district. Does that make sense? Does that not? We saw a lot, particularly in COVID, of people leaving more of downtown to go out to areas where they could get a yard. And that also may drive the cost of the house up, but now you have a place for your child to run around within a gated territory. And what kind of added comfort and lifestyle does that end up bringing you? So concepts like that become really critical as to how it's going to impact other kinds of purchases.
Yeah, that's definitely a big thought, and understanding what that's going to be. And again, going back to Dan's point, but when we were speaking earlier, bigger, religious type investments or charitable type investments or whatever it may be, there's a lot of other costs that might be coming with children that's not expected. Again, extracurricular activities, depending on what you'd like for your children to do. Some are more expensive, some are less. It just totally depends on what your household wants to value. What value do you place on it? And that's never it's not a wrong or right answer. It only becomes a wrong answer if you don't ask yourself those questions to then be able to say, how do I allocate my money in the best way possible based off what I value? Because that's going to bring the best happiness, quote unquote, to that money. Right. So to give a very good, contrast between Dan and I, Dan is going to do bat mitzvah for his daughter. I won't. I'm not Jewish. So there's a very big difference. It's a different in cost for him versus me. But I grew up in the mountains and I love to snowboard. My kids will probably go to ski school. Leora, probably not. May not be something that I wants to do. Didn't grow up on the slopes. I did. So that's not wrong or right. That's just more so of a difference in what we value and what we like, and making sure that we try to get our kids involved in those things as well to, again, continue to perpetuate those values over time, generation to generation. And that's what's really more important. And again, that can then get very dicey when you then bring in a spouse who may have completely different ideas on what those values may be. And having those conversations really help be able to create an actual plan so that everyone's on the same page and everyone's excited about where that money is potentially being funded. But you'd be surprised at how many of these conversations we have where all of a sudden it's like, well, that's not what I think. And they're like, what? I didn't know that. It happens more often than not.
Yeah. We actually have some stats too on when it comes to educational costs, more of the tangibles. We're talking right now about a lot of the intangibles that are important to consider when preparing for something like funding the education elements, if you wish to do so for these children.
Yeah. So I mean, like a really good data point that we have from Schwab, if your child was born today, so 18 years from now, and their first go to their first year of college, having 4 years of tuition and fees, including room and board. So that means, in a dorm room or something close to it. The projected cost roughly in today's dollars would probably be about $242,000. That may actually not be in today's dollars. That may be a growth in that over time. I don't know what the growth rate is. But again, 242, that's typically what we see when we're running projections for paying for full school. Typically speaking, with our clientele, they are at an income level where they probably will not receive federal benefits, where they would have to pay for school unless their children did get scholarships or some sort of like athletic scholarship, educational scholarship. They would most likely be having to pay, which is interesting. The other one too is just saving in general. This gives a good idea of compounded growth. So if you were to begin contributing $500 per month for college savings at birth, assuming a 5.8% rate of return, which I'd say is conservative, I like that rate, your savings sum would total about $213,600 by the time they reach 17. If you postpone saving until your child is 10, then your savings would roughly be about $78,400. So it just shows the idea that being able to do some over time does compound over that 18-year time frame. Now, again, where to set that up, 529, non-qualified, how do we kind of mix and match is important. Now, however, what we always want to emphasize is like, yes, this is great. However, you always have to then look at other things that are going on. Just because you want to save for college doesn't mean that you can, because maybe you want to buy that house. Maybe you have other ideas. Maybe you have other things. So you have to then figure out what is the main priority in having those, again, conversations. Because like I said, maybe you're like, I don't want to do $242,000. I want to do about 100, or maybe not even that much, maybe 80. Again, not a wrong or right answer. It's just more so of understanding what that answer is so you can have a better idea of what you want to achieve.
And speaking of some figures, there are some beneficial tax breaks that we often do discuss as well.
Yeah, some of the tax breaks, like, so again, the maximum child dependent care credit is about $1,000 for one child, $2,100 for two. That's based on 2023. Those obviously adjust year to year. They can change depending on legislation. FSA accounts or flexible spending accounts can be very beneficial. So you essentially can contribute to this type of account up to $5,000. You will not pay your income taxes on that. It will be tax deferred or tax free that you can put into this account. And then as long as you spend it on dependent care, so if it was your nanny, if it was technically, even if it was your grandparent that was the nanny that you were paying, you could even use it for that. Or if it's a child care facility, that's where it can go. It's just a really good way. Unfortunately, that's not probably good enough to cover all your costs. It is just an added benefit to be optimizing. Obviously, we push it very hard. If you're going to do it, it's a no-brainer. Like, you should just do it as long as you have the ability to do it. But don't expect it to cover all of your costs. As we mentioned, you're probably looking more of like 20 to 60 grand, depending on what you do and how you facilitate that. That's something that's really important over time. And there's some other benefits too when it comes to childcare, but those are just a few that are just kind of off the top of the food chain that are kind of easy and pretty straightforward.
Back to educational costs too. The some of those 529 plans, which is a very popular vehicle to save for educational costs, can also come with tax breaks.
Yep.
Some states allow for that, some do not. California, for example, does not have a tax break today. Since we talked about California, Wisconsin does.
They shut that down a few times. They got it pretty close though. California's they've tried, and they had a pretty good one. They had a good proposal, but they've shut it down decent. I think twice now. They got through so many levels of the legislation. But yeah, and 529 plans are really great vehicles, specifically for educational planning. I know we've talked about it on other podcasts, but they can be very beneficial. You just have to understand them. They've made some updates to it for Secure Act 2.0. So technically you can roll some of that money into a Roth in case they don't use it. Because Dan and I always have these conversations. We just literally had this conversation before this in a different subject, but you don't have a child yet. They're not born. You have no idea who they are, what they're going to be. They could be a lot of different things. And they may say, hey, mom and dad, I'm not going to college. Check you later. Like, they could easily do that at 18. Or they could say, hey, I want to go to trade school. Good thing though, trade schools do count. As long as they're accredited, they can be applied to 529 plans. So the 529 plans are quite liberal, and they're making them more liberal to make sure you don't get stuck in a hole where you get penalized if you can't use it. So
any final thoughts?
Final thoughts. I think it's a big deal. Having a kid's a big deal. It's not a small thing. It's things you should look at. Really, if you were to boil it down, you just got to go through a checklist, review your budget, review your cash flow, do any projections. You got to look at your estate planning, insurance planning, educational planning, or other big event planning. Really looking at some of the tax breaks, making sure you just let your accountant know, or if you're doing your taxes on your own, usually like a TurboTax or some of these online providers will say, hey, did you have a child? Do you now have a child? Do you now have a dependent? So they can help you out getting some of these tax breaks. But it's really just kind of walking through and having those discussions. Some of these discussions are not easy. But I would say that it's just communication. Nathaniel is very big on communication within this firm. And I would echo that back to everybody else, that communicating with your spouse, communicating with yourself, and just being realistic about it is extremely important. It will help make sure that everyone's on the same page and moving forward in the same direction, because now it's becoming more of a unit. With adding another dependent, it usually is creating that true household, because both two people have to see this little thing grow moving forward. Even in the event of divorce, you still have to figure out what you would contribute, right? It is going to be something that is there for a while or a time being. So having those discussions early and often can make a lot of sense. What about you?
Well, I think just don't forget about the intangible costs, intangibles in general. It's great, and you need to figure out what the baseline costs are going to be. A lot of things we covered today, right? The what costs of schooling, what costs of birth, what changes to the medical plan, what cost of childcare is going to look like. Yeah, you need to do that. And it's not easy to figure out, but it's somewhat easier to kind of think about because they're known costs. But it's the things you may not think about. I'll tell you the biggest surprise when I became a parent from intangible costs and experience and education that I did not think of, and I think a lot of parents don't think about, is living close to family. Makes a huge difference for not only just what it means to that child growing, but what it means to your pocket. Without that in play, it get really expensive from a daycare standpoint, among other things too. So, thank you to the people that live close enough that have helped me, which includes Tim and other people here at the firm that have been so instrumental in being there for Leora and providing help with her growing, and also with childcare at times. That's not usually thought about, I think, by a lot of parents before the child arrives. And another great, I think, example of intangibles too is how much time you're going to take off. Some companies are fantastic about really making a big effort on allowing time for parents to be with their infant children, but most probably fall short. That's a really important time from a bonding experience for all parents. So you may need to talk about and consider, how much time do I need to take off, not just to recover from the medical process, but also just to have time with your child. You don't get that back. So the intangibles, I really think, just need a bit more attention.
That's a good point. I like that. Those are, yeah, I haven't not experienced it, so I don't know those intangibles quite yet.
Oh, they're there. And we'll leave you with that. We have other tips we'd love to share at some point as children get older, other things to consider, like helping them build credit and understand money. We've talked about that in other podcasts about parenting and so on, but that's for another day. So without further ado, we appreciate you tuning in once again. Have a great evening and take care of yourselves.
Like and subscribe.
Thank you for taking the time to start your journey of thinking differently and listening to LBW talk about stuff they love. Until next time.